the United States presents itself internationally as the defender of freedom and democracy, but it's actually the complete opposite. It has been the defender of profit and terror. It wasn't the case in Chile when a democratic president was overthrown in 1973. It wasn't the case in Argentina in 1976 when a very brutal military regime came to power and killed anywhere between 30 to 40,000 people that were tied up and thrown out of airplanes for simply being members of a trade union. If you look at that, you know, that role in the international arena, is that a country that you really want to be associated with?
Hello, and welcome back to Bogan Intel. Today we'll be exploring one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world, the developing conflict between the US and Venezuela. Dr. Rodrigo Acuña joins us again to give some insight into what the developments might mean, including recent actions that saw oil tankers seized in international waters. This has prompted action from the Maduro government, which has provided naval escorts for tankers leaving Venezuelan waters, also bringing in other key international players like China, who depend on Venezuelan oil, their energy dependence. Please stick around for what will be an informative episode with Dr. Rodrigo Acuña. Rodrigo, welcome back to Bogan Intel.
Thank you for having me.
With tensions in the Caribbean peaking this week, can you recap the US actions over the last week or so, including the seizures of oil tankers that have only inflamed the situation?
So the United States, as the Trump administration has claimed that it needs to engage in naval operations in the Caribbean Sea, specifically off the coast of Venezuela, targeting speedboats, which it alleges, without having provided any serious evidence, that these speedboats are smuggling drugs into the United States. So it is therefore just basically blowing them up out of the water. And it's also now declared a naval blockade on tankers coming in or coming out of Venezuela. So I think according to the latest information now, a second tanker has been seized by the United States.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is obviously going to have an impact on the Venezuelan economy, which has been growing in the last 17, 18 quarters. And obviously, it's meant to put pressure on the Venezuelan military to carry out a coup d'etat against President Nicolas Maduro. So the situation is certainly quite tense, and whether the United States decides to carry out land strikes on Venezuelan territory itself remains to be seen. It could happen, it could not. It's hard to read, but now we are up to, I think, something like 95 or 97 civilians which have been killed in these strikes against these speedboats, which should be emphasized, don't have the capacity to reach the United States. And the overwhelming majority of fentanyl that goes into the United States comes through Mexico, and the majority of cocaine that comes out of Latin America comes out of Colombia. So Venezuela, according to most respected international experts on the drug trade, including a report from the United Nations, states that Venezuela is a minor transit point in terms of the flow of drugs into world markets. So all of these statements that have come out of the White House have not been supported by any evidence.
And there was that cartel of the sun that was attributed to Venezuela that was pulled out of some kind of, hat, like a rabbit. But that has connections to the CIA itself, which was debunked quite early in the piece, right?
That's right. The cartel of the Sun was a reference to a cooperation that existed between the United States and I think sections of the Venezuelan military in the past, and it was basically taken out of a badge that had a sun on it. Um, and there's no actual proof that there is a cartel of the sun. It has been the understanding is that we're talking about previous members of the Venezuelan drug enforcement, which were corrupt, and were engaging in some level of participation with the drug cartels. But to then try and structure that all the way to say that that incorporates the higher echelons of the Venezuelan state, there's no actual evidence for that.
And the whole guise of narco-terrorism, which has been the main casus belli, essentially for the US to move on Venezuela, has kind of been conflicted with these tanker seizures. So, how do the tanker interceptions fit into the US narrative around narco-terrorism?
Well, it's an impossible link that anyone with half a brain will realize can't be made. The objective of the United States previously, starting from the Bush II administration back in 2002, was to overthrow President Hugo Chavez. The United States, whether it's been the administrations under the Democrats or the Republicans, has always been almost incapable of coexisting with progressive or leftist governments in Latin America. So they've traditionally tried to impose or apply economic pressure, political pressure. If that doesn't work, well, then they'll move on to sanctions. If that doesn't work, they'll move on to trying to create the conditions or the climate for a coup d'etat. So in 2002, President Hugo Chavez was overthrown briefly for about 72 hours. He was eventually rescued by sections of the Venezuelan military that were loyal to him. But after that, a whole series of sanctions were imposed on Venezuela, uh, culminating at or moving towards a higher peak in 2016 when Barack Obama said that Venezuela was a security threat to the United States, and a series of even harsher sanctions have been applied. The United States has essentially been looking to get rid of the Venezuelan government for a long time, and this is simply the latest excuse it has used to try and do that. It has nothing to do with corrupt sections of the Venezuelan government, which yes, they do exist. It has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with almost anything else that the United States has to say on the matter. What it has to do is the fact that since Hugo Chavez came to power in early 1999, Venezuela embarked on a process of developing an independent foreign policy. It embarked on a process of increasing um, taxes on US and foreign oil companies. It did embark on a process of nationalization of certain sectors of the country's economy. And you can agree or disagree with that, but the point is that Venezuela never took the position of trying to completely break with the United States. It was simply trying to renegotiate a better deal for its people. And as imperfect as that process has been, it has been a process which has been viewed as completely unacceptable to the United States. Because if Venezuela does that successfully, then other countries in the region might decide to imitate it.
And as a consequence, Venezuela has been an honorary member of the Axis of Evil ever since, I suppose, since that Chavez era. And, it's interesting that you mentioned Obama there. Once again, Obama, someone that did a fairly good job at destabilizing or redefining middle powers that weren't fitting into the US imperial remit. I do want to ask you a little bit. So, or you mentioned oil, and Trump made a comment the other day, essentially saying we're going to get back our oil from Venezuela. I can't remember the exact way he said the words.
It's the blockade. We're not going to let let anybody going through that shouldn't be going through. You remember they took all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil from not that long ago, and we want it back. But they took it. They illegally took it.
Maduro's now, really been leaning in about that and saying Trump's revealed his motives, that he wants to seize Venezuelan oil and land. As you say, it runs counterintuitive to the drug trafficking rationale. So how does this align with ongoing US strikes on alleged drug smuggling vessels?
The United States for a very long time, and when I say the United States, I'm talking about its political and economic elites. I'm talking about its large corporations that have deep interest, economic and political interest in Latin America. I'm not talking about the average citizen of the United States. This section of the United States has always viewed Latin America as its backyard. So when oil was discovered in the early 1900s, around about 1910, 1908, the US oil companies quickly moved in, and they, in fact, the United States, had supported a coup d'etat against a nationalist military leader called Cipriano Castro. And another military leader called Vicente Gomez took over the country and ruled it for several decades. And he was happy to welcome US multinationals to develop the oil industry. And since then, the ties between the two countries have been incredibly close, to the point where Venezuelan oil was actually refined. It was extracted obviously in Venezuela, but it was then refined in the United States. So for Trump to say that they would like the United States would like its oil back, I mean, if you try and view things from their perspective, I guess they have always viewed Venezuelan oil as their oil, even though it actually is on Venezuelan territory.
Are you
Yes.
talking about that multi-billion-dollar, one-of-a-kind Louisiana refinery there? Like that, there's like heavy crude refineries that have been made specifically for Venezuelan oil, isn't there?
So there's a company called Citgo, and Citgo was developed specifically to refine Venezuelan oil in the United States, and then also sell Venezuelan oil in the United States. So yes, there are several refineries inside the United States, and a couple of years ago, the United States actually just um, you know, I don't know if you want to say expropriated the or seized, I think would be the better word, seized the company from Venezuela. And again, it's because of this clash where Washington has viewed it as unacceptable that the government in Venezuela, or the governments, Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, have decided to embark on a path of independence, or a path that is going to try and negotiate a better deal with US companies and foreign companies, better deals for their own people, and try and pursue an independent path for their own country and also for the region. You have to understand that Venezuela invested a lot in its foreign policy in creating multilateral organizations in South America, which were going to bring the countries in the region together and allow them to try and renegotiate on numerous fronts with the United States. The best example of that is UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. Organization's almost dead now, but for several years, when there were political crises taking place in the region, the foreign ministers of numerous South American countries were getting together at UNASUR first, having a discussion about, a coup d'etat or a possible coup d'etat in Ecuador, for example, and then getting together at the Organization of American States. The OAS has historically been the most dominant and the most important organization in the Western Hemisphere when a crisis has occurred. And that organization, if you know any history of the region, of the Western Hemisphere, has been almost completely dominated by the United States. The United States has always pushed for its agenda, and 9 out of 10 has always succeeded in getting its way. So for Venezuela to have actually invested in an organization like UNASUR, or the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, for example, or Petrocaribe, or signing agreements with Cuba in so that they could provide eye care for people, for disenfranchised people in South America. That it has been viewed, and quite accurately, as a threat to the US economic model in Latin America, which has always promoted um, governments that are there basically just to manage resources for the interest of foreign corporations. Local elites have had very little accountability to the domestic populations, and for too long they have always been far too happy to cater to to foreign interest as opposed to domestic interest.
Yeah, it's an incredible insight there. I had no idea about the romantic connection that the oil companies have with Venezuela, essentially, the way that they view that resource in there as something that's almost preordained. Is this just a byproduct of what Monroe Doctrine is going to be? Will there be will these organizations, these Latin American organizations, only strengthen over time? Or with, say, the result in Chile that happened the other week, is there going to be a contest within the Americas, within Latin America itself, over those ideas?
Well, the 2025 National Security Strategy, which was published at the beginning of December, specifically talked about how the United States needs to return to sort of key principles of the Monroe Doctrine of viewing or focusing on the Western Hemisphere. If we know anything about the Monroe Doctrine, if we recall the Monroe Doctrine was about keeping European or other foreign powers, but specifically European powers, out of the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was no longer to be colonized by anyone else. And the United States, although in publicly it declared that it supported the independence movements of Latin America, and it supported these new independent republics. It knew that essentially these republics were always going to be too weak for them to be able to negotiate on a sort of more equal playing field with the United States. So the return to the Monroe Doctrine makes, I guess, sense if from the Trump administration's perspective of trying to assert its hegemony once again over Latin America. And in the short term, they do appear to be winning. There is a hard right or an extremist right government in power in Argentina. There is a new hard right government in Chile. The question, of course, is how long will these governments remain in power? Will they be successful in carrying out their agendas? And at what point will the left be able to take office again? Or what will the region look like if the United States, in the absolute worst case scenario, decides to carry out a full sort of scale invasion of Venezuela? Then the region is going to look very different, and it's going to become quite complicated. But that the United States has, or the Trump administration has decided to focus its efforts again on Latin America. Um, I think it's in part to do with the fact that Marco Rubio is ideologically driven, and Marco Rubio is, of course, of Cuban heritage and has a visceral hatred of the Cuban Revolution. And that, having someone like him have the power that he does inside the United States is of course incredibly dangerous for progressive forces in Latin America.
And he also has the enthusiasm too, right? I wanted to ask you about Marco Rubio himself. We haven't had a Secretary of State with such a, personal vested interest in the region like this. And with the Trump administration being so discombobulated in foreign affairs right now, potentially some of these things are just defaulting to certain people within the administration. How much is the naval buildup in the region about intimidation as opposed to the will to use it as an act of force As you said, the land invasion is essentially still up in the air. First, I want to know a little bit about the competing interests in Washington that are arguing for and against the land invasion, and what you actually think about the amount of resource that has been built up in the area, and if there's an inevitability to it being used now that it has been deployed in such a way.
Well, I don't think anything's is inevitable until key decisions are actually made. So if a decision has been made inside Washington that at a certain date land strikes are going to take place, then the situation could change. Um, in terms of the United States having enough military force to actually invade Venezuela, my understanding, according to the experts that I've read, is that it doesn't actually have that available force yet. It can certainly carry out land strikes. It can certainly target military targets, communications, telecommunications, and it can certainly do a lot of damage to Venezuela. But to actually invade the country and to occupy it, it's going to need a lot more troops. You have to remember that so far the Venezuelan military has remained loyal to the Bolivarian project, the Bolivarian Revolution. And you also have to remember that the Venezuelan military, the Venezuelan government, has developed a militia, quite a large militia, which aims to defend the country precisely under these, sort of scenario. Venezuela's military strategy is also developed around guerrilla warfare. So they're aware that in a confrontation with the United States, their conventional forces are not going to be able to fight for long, because the United States has simply superior firepower. But if they do land troops, that's when a sort of insurgency or a guerrilla warfare can begin to take place. And Venezuela is quite a complex terrain and has a lot of jungle. And this is something that the Venezuelan military would have been studying and developing strategies and tactics around for a very long time. So that's where things stand in terms of the, the United States actually carrying out a strike, and what things may look like if they decide to do that. If diplomacy were to triumph, and there are apparently, or there have been talks between high-level officials of the Maduro administration and Trump officials in trying to cut a deal with the United States where the United States gets a large cut of Venezuela's oil resources. That is something that might also take place. I think the chances of that occurring are slimmer. But it really it remains to be seen. Right now, the United States does not have enough uh, troops amassed out, off the coast of Venezuela to be able to invade the country. But if it decides to carry out land strikes, it does have the capacity to do that.
I'm wondering if it could do a Yemen style long-term campaign off the coast of the waters there, where it looks to strategically hit targets, things like that. So there's no chance. I mean, could there be anyone in the White House that's saying, hey, we could do a Panama style incursion in Venezuela and mess a few things up and kind of, overthrow the government or something like that? There's no sort of cowboys that might be looking for that kind
Well,
of action.
well, Trump himself was talking about that. Trump himself, back in the first administration, was talking about that and asked, well, why can't we just invade Venezuela like we did Panama? And it had to be explained to him that Panama, A, was much smaller. B, the United States had something like 5,000 troops already inside Panama because Panama had US military bases.
Mhm.
But Venezuela is much larger. It's a much larger country. It has quite a few Russian surface-to-air missiles. It has about 24 um, fourth generation Russian fighter jets, which will create some problems for the United States, certainly on the short term front. Um, so that there are people inside the Trump administration that are very gung ho, and I would say Marco Rubio is one of them. Yes, they are certainly there, but when you start talking to um, you know, four-star generals and people that actually understand warfare and understand the history of warfare, they would know that currently they need far more troops. This is going to be very bloody. So what I suspect they would be advising would be maybe to just carry out some strategic strikes and just try and grind them down. That's what happened to Iraq for about 10 years. You had a northern, I think the northern no-fly zone was applied first, and then I think a southern no-fly zone, maybe the other way around. But essentially, the Iraqi Air Force was destroyed, their surface-to-air missiles were destroyed, and by the time the United States decided to invade Iraq, the morale in the Iraqi military was extremely low. So if the United States, if the Trump administration is dead set on trying to overthrow Maduro militarily, a smarter option would be to try and grind them down first for at least a few months.
And with Iraq too, there was over a decade of sanctions, no-fly zones between the two wars. By the time they came back in 2003, as you said, the morale of the country had been drained over a decade. Right now, you mentioned that there's a huge zeal in the Venezuelan population towards the Bolivarian struggle. And with large militias in place, and the Maduro factor himself as a leader and how he embraces the population, how they embrace him. Like you mentioned, with the generals considering the terrain and topography and the actual unique factors about Venezuela here that make a land invasion, seem almost impossible right now. How do you think these, these comments coming in from overseas, but also say the seizure of the tankers and the added bearing pressure from military pressure? How do you think that is doing with the solidarity of Venezuelan people? Is it testing it, or do you think it's galvanizing it?
Well, I think my understanding is that it's currently galvanizing it. My understanding is that even sections of the opposition have now called on their supporters to join the militias and to fight a potential US invasion. Machado did have a support from a section of the population, and the opposition has always had a support from a section of the population which has never accepted the goals, the objectives, the principles of the Bolivarian Revolution. And that section of the population has fluctuated between 30%, 35%, 40%, even higher than that. It fluctuates, and it's there and it's real. But at the same time, the what's almost systematically ignored by the mainstream media is the 55%, the close to 60%, the sometimes less than 50%, but it's there. It's a significant part of the population which support the Bolivarian Revolution. They're there. They're not going to go away. They're the ones that were community activists that supported Hugo Chavez when he ran for the elections in 1998. They're the ones that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to take to the streets when Chavez was kidnapped by a small section of the Venezuelan military in 2002. They're the ones that have welcomed 20, maybe even 30,000 Cuban doctors and teachers into the slums. They're the ones that have continued to support the government because for all of its contradictions and problems and corruption, etc., 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 they're the ones that have actually seen the benefits of having a popular government in power, which has created a significant amount of housing projects, new high schools, medical clinics, hospitals, reading programs. It has invested in sports. Venezuela has done far better under the Bolivarian Revolution in 20 years at the Olympics than it did for 100 years. Those results are results that people that continue to live in Venezuela, or experts like myself, are aware of. They're results that simply can't be erased because you may ideologically oppose them or disagree with what the Bolivarian Revolution stands for. So that basis of support has continued. Sometimes it erodes, sometimes it decreases, sometimes it increases, but it's still there. And for now, those that section of the population are the ones that are going to probably fight, not probably, they are going to fight the hardest to defend what they believe are their rightful gains under the current government.
If you're enjoying these interviews with people like Dr. Rodrigo Acuña and some of the other guests we've had on, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Any interaction that you can make with this lowly Bogan product helps to get it out there and beat the algorithm. Bogan Intelligentsia has to compete with some big players out there. So any public support can mean more than you could imagine. If you're feeling adventurous, head to www.boganintel.com, where you can have access to articles and this podcast. Now back to the program. And it's been a good 30 years almost of this revolution being in place. Is it how long would you count the revolutionary period?
Oh, well, they came. I mean, the Chavez came to power in early 1999. So we are now in 2025, 26 years.
Nearly 30 years, yeah.
Yeah, nearly 30 years.
And around it has been the same old neoliberal gamesmanship from their northern neighbor in the United States. And Venezuelans have seen the ebb and flow of that relation shifting in the region around them. So yes, I mean, it's incredible that they've eked out their own way of living within this, pretty complex environment. In your Truthout article, you reference war games from Trump's first term, one of the many war games that's been thrown out at Venezuela, saying that post-Maduro, that scenario would potentially see the end of the Chavez movement. And the Bolivarian revolution would be over in Venezuela. Do you see that there's a potential that that could happen, that Maduro really is a cult of personality, and that there's nothing, that there's nothing after him? Or are there viable replacements that aren't reported on in the West for this revolution?
I think there was a slight cult of the personality around Chavez. I think that's something that has always occurred in Latin America around leftist and progressive leaders, because they have attempted, and in many cases they have actually delivered, that for their constituency, that working class people in Argentina, for example, still remember General Perón, even though Perón has been dead for decades. But he is seen as such a significant figure in the history of Argentina in terms of giving trade unions and workers rights, that a sort of a cult of the personality developed around Perón. The same was the case with Fidel Castro in Cuba. The same was the case with Hugo Chavez. The thing is is that cult of the personality taken to the extent where people will engage in actions that are completely irrational? And I don't think that's the case. I think that they have always viewed those leaders as representing them and representing their interest. But those leaders have also said that they themselves are replaceable. They themselves are going to be replaced by other leaders, which are going to continue fighting for the ideas that they believed that were necessary to fight for. So Nicolas Maduro himself was ended up, heading the Bolivarian revolution, because once Chavez was ill and realized that there was a very real situation where he was going to die from cancer, he said to his supporters, I would like all of you to back Nicolas Maduro, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. I would like everyone to back him. Now, there were other people that were supporters of Diosdado Cabello. He's a former high-ranking member of the Venezuelan military. But certainly, I mean, once the United States, if the United States decides to invade Venezuela and overthrow Maduro, other leaders will emerge. There are enough people inside Venezuela that still support the project, believe in the project, that, as I said, they will fight hard. And these scenarios that the United States has these war games that they've played out, the conclusion from these war games are that Venezuela is going to be it's going to descend into total chaos, and it's going to take maybe 10 years for political stability to be reached. The United States and any government that it decides to support after it has overthrown Nicolas Maduro is going to have to carry out a massive amount of human rights violations. It's going to have to be a very, very bloody US-backed military dictatorship. And it might not be able to succeed. There might still be enough sections of the Venezuelan military that are prepared to continue fighting as insurgents. You have the ELN, the National Liberation Guerrillas from Colombia, which are just on the border of Venezuela. They're going to become a factor. I would not be surprised. In fact, I would be surprised if it weren't the case, if Cuban military advisors weren't already present in Venezuela. The same thing for Nicaraguans. And I think that other sympathizers of the Bolivarian Revolution are going to end up in Venezuela supporting the insurgency. So this is going to be a very brutal and bloody outcome if the United States decides to militarily invade Venezuela and try and overthrow Maduro.
And I also wonder about the political repercussions of that, right? I mean, when's the last time? I mean, it's a long time has elapsed since those Oliver North, John Bolton wars of the 80s and 90s. And I wonder how the continent actually will respond to an invasion.
We now live in the age of social media. You have to remember that we now live in the age of social media. So when images start coming out of Venezuela of US troops, invading the country and committing atrocities, as is often the case with almost every foreign invading army, that's going to create a lot of anger and overlooking the fact that Venezuela was the cradle really of South American independence. It's something that people in the United States might not be aware of, but Latin Americans are aware of this, and that the leader of five republics that became independent, Simon Bolivar, he was from Venezuela, and he
That's right.
developed his own political thinking, which has remained alive until this day. And that's something that the Venezuelans are going to draw from, and other sympathizers of the Bolivarian Revolution are going to draw from. And as I said, the United States might be successful. It probably will be successful because it has the military might to do that, to invade the country and to overthrow and kill Nicolas Maduro. But it is incorrect in assuming that the Bolivarian Revolution starts in the presidential palace of Venezuela and it ends there. That's simply not the case.
That's right. And it also does some damage to the fine work that they've been doing in, slowly changing over these governments in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru.
If we go back to the 1960s, when Che Guevara decided to go to Bolivia, Che Guevara decided to go to Bolivia precisely because Bolivia was ruled by a US-backed military regime. His own expedition, adventure, whatever you want to call it, was unsuccessful because of a lack of um, not strategic, but really sort of on the ground, logistical. That's the word, logistical planning, which failed to be accurately coordinated. Promises were made to him that were not kept. But even then, with the very small band of guerrillas that he brought over from Cuba and the very small number of Bolivians that were prepared to fight with him, they managed to last several months against US-backed Green Beret troops. And his idea was to create an insurgency in Bolivia that would fight against the Bolivian dictatorship, but also eventually spread towards fighting in other countries. the Latin American left has long had a debate, or it had a debate, especially specifically during the Cold War, as to how do you really carry out deep change in the region if you're going to be faced with local oligarchies that are incapable of accepting you winning office through the democratic path. I mean, if the lesson is you can win an election, but then you're going to be overthrown through a US-backed military coup, well, then what's the point of engaging in that whole electoral process? You might as well try and create insurgent armies, guerrilla movements to try and overthrow them. And that was at least that was Che Guevara's position. He lost in Bolivia, but then when you had US-backed military regimes in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Central America, you had massive insurgencies because all paths towards democratic change, towards progressive change were blocked. So if the Trump administration were insane enough to invade Venezuela, you know, you could see maybe a regional insurgency taking place in Venezuela, being and that being reminiscent to what Che Guevara originally wanted to achieve in the 1960s.
And I imagine the top brass at the Pentagon are ringing the bell a little bit about that one every day, as the Trump administration and people like Rubio tried to, yeah, twist everyone's arm into taking this action. I wanted to talk a little bit about the developing geopolitical context of this standoff here, particularly around China. China buys 45% of Venezuela's oil, and it's now disrupted by a blockade there. How do you think Beijing will continue to respond moving forward as these actions intensify? And could this become could Venezuela become the first proxy in a US-China confrontation?
That might be the case. That might be the case. I mean, I don't know what the planners inside Beijing are thinking or aiming to do. I can only tell you what has been occurring. And what has been occurring is that yes, China has invested or has made inroads into Latin America unlike any other power in the history of the region in the last 100 years. During the Cold War, Latin America was closed off to foreign interest other than certain European interest, but no one else was really allowed to engage in major investments or military cooperation with Latin American countries. And China has done something different. It has actually managed to penetrate Latin American markets. It has established very good relations with a number of countries in Latin America. And of course, the United States is not pleased. I mean, the Trump administration managed to pressure Panama to basically exclude Chinese companies from the Panama Canal. It said if it didn't do that, it was basically just going to invade Panama. So what Beijing decides to do in response to that? Well, maybe you would have to ask an expert on China to tell you what they might decide to do. I mean, they might decide to put more pressure on Taiwan, for example. They might decide to, if an oil tanker, if a Chinese oil tanker was seized, for example, or maybe China decides to seize a US oil tanker. Who knows? China historically has always tried to play on the side of caution. I think China is certainly aware that the United States has greater military might. China's been looking to assert its own territorial waters. All this talk about China expanding and wanting to be this sort of global military power. Well, it's certainly an economic power, but militarily, I mean, what are, what are the number of aircraft carriers that China currently has? I think, what is it, two,
A
one?
couple, yeah.
But it's how many does the United States have? Far more. How many nuclear weapons does the United States have? How many bombers does the United States have? I mean, it's there's still no comparison. So I think China will be cautious, but what cards they decide to play remains to be seen. But that they do have some cards to play, I think they do.
And China, as you say, has been so heavily involved in investing in that region. I mean, there's recently been completed a transcontinental railroad, hasn't there, somewhere through the Andes there?
Yes, and investments in Peru, in a new port in Peru, investments in Nicaragua, investments in the oil industry in Venezuela. The difference is that China has been prepared to offer lower interest rates on their deals, on their loans, than the United States historically has been. The difference is that that China has been willing to exchange technology or engage in transfers of technology as opposed to the United States. And that's something that is appealing to certain Latin American countries.
Which we saw with those floating oil derricks on the lakes there in Venezuela, right? That was a new technology that was deployed in Venezuela, right?
Yes, that's my understanding. And again, how the United States is, I don't think the United States would be viewing any of those developments in a positive manner, because it means that the Venezuelan government can continue carrying out its projects and can not ignore the US economic blockade, but it starts to get around it. And that's a problem, because if you're going to impose trade sanctions, you want them to take effect.
Mm. So Beijing is a big factor here, and it's only going to become a more important factor. You're going to have to wonder how a country that gets 45% of its crude can stay out of this conflict if it begins to ramp up. I mean, not, maybe not with material or anything like that, but every other form of support possible, including arming proxies in the region, or who knows, if it becomes too dangerous for their own national security. I wanted just to ask quickly about Guyana. And there's some tension on the border there with Guyana. And can you just give us a little bit of detail about that?
So historically, Venezuela has always laid claim to a section of that country's territory, and that's because the maps back in the 1800s weren't clearly defined. So the Venezuelans claimed that the certain territory belonged to Venezuela. Guyana, on the other hand, claimed that the territory belonged to them. And there's also I understand some minerals that are available in a part of that region, and that's something that foreign companies are all too keen to get their hands on. So they're willing to exploit those tensions, those divisions, and instead of trying to promote peaceful solution, they're going to be there trying to exploit those tensions. I don't think Maduro at times has handled that situation in the best manner. I think some statements have been made that have been unnecessary. But on the other hand, Western interests have generally never played a positive role in the internal affairs of Latin American countries. They've always been looking to exploit those tensions in order for them to gain maximum benefits.
Yeah. Um, so your article predicts a legitimacy crisis if there is a regime change in Venezuela, and the same neoliberal policies that you see in Argentina and now Chile have been promised by Machado if and the people that she represents if they come into power.
Forget about Saudi Arabia. Forget about the Saudis. I mean, we have more oil. I mean, infinite potential. And we're going to open markets. We're going to kick off the government.
What alternatives to political change are there in Venezuela that you advocate essentially?
If Machado comes to power, or someone like Machado comes to power, they're certainly going to be looking to engage in large privatizations. They're certainly going to be completely winding down the programs that have been developed under the Bolivarian Revolution, where royalties from the oil industry have been invested in local communities. And that's something that if you travel to Venezuela, as I have on numerous occasions, you're able to see. You're able to see new housing developments that look absolutely beautiful. You see people that are no longer living in slums. You still see a lot of slums. I mean, they haven't managed to get rid of them because there are so many of them. And the country still has many, many problems. But the fact that you can actually witness uh, changes, palpable changes on the streets, those are things that the local population have. Um, so I would say that some of the younger generations have simply just taken for granted. They've seen, those changes. They've grown up under almost 30 years of the Bolivarian Revolution. So it's going to be a real shock for them if the country witnesses a war, a very bloody war, and then witnesses radical changes in policy. I don't think those changes are going to be um, absorbed, are going to be handled, are going to be accepted by the general population in a positive manner. They're going to be those policies are going to have to be implemented through a lot of brute force. It's that simple.
Yeah, and with people like Machado promising the alternative, but when you look at something like Argentina right now, who the country's going into a downward spiral, a neoliberal death spiral there under Malay. You have to wonder how the Venezuelans would receive something like that, particularly because they haven't been speaking that economic language at all over the last few decades in their society. Um, and looking forward to the year ahead, and potentially the end of the year, what advice do you give to policymakers in Washington to avoid what would be a disaster for Washington, and a disaster for Latin America?
Well, I don't think policymakers would listen to me at all, but if they were to ask me for my advice, I would simply ask them to engage in dialogue, to look for dialogue with Venezuela, to come to an understanding that they can still make a significant amount of profits if they're willing to meet the Venezuelans halfway or somewhere along the way. A war is going to be absolutely devastating for Venezuela. It's going to make a lot of money for US weapons industry. They're going to make a lot of money. But unfortunately, as always, as with all wars, it's the population that pays the highest price, whether it's from the imperial center, from the country that's invading, or whether it's the country that's on the receiving end. So, if they wanted to avoid such a human disaster, they shouldn't engage in it. But the people that are in charge now in Washington are, I would say, almost thoroughly corrupt. I mean, every day now, I think Trump is surrounding himself by yes men, the professional class in Washington. I think certain elements of it are starting to be stripped away. And Trump is surrounding himself with more yes men, and that's why he's becoming more bold, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. His attacks on the judiciary, putting ICE on the streets, and moving really towards an authoritarian or a fascist state. And when you have a fascist state, you really don't need um, a consensus from the population. I mean, fascist states just go to war. That's it. The leader says we're going to war, we're going to war. So if the Trump administration is able to consolidate its power the way it has been attempting to consolidate its power in the last few months in the United States, and we see, for example, the suspension of the next elections, then certainly, the United States might invade Venezuela and be engaged in a very brutal and bloody war. Um, how that plays out will depend on how people inside the United States decide to mobilize, how they decide to take on the Trump administration and try and hold on to whatever democracy they still have left.
And this is the first time we've seen a fascist superpower in a long time as well. And as you say, fascist countries go to war and fascist superpowers, challenge regions. and break norms across the world. Uh, Something I just want to finish on here. In Australia, many people look at Venezuela as something in America's backyard. It's so far away. And, even in the US itself, seeing Mamdani and people on the left, for example, be able to accommodate such thing as a war in the Monroe Doctrine delineations of America's new outlook. This is essentially another resource war to uproot a whole bunch of resources from Venezuela. And it's done in the same tradition that we've seen these other wars conducted over the last couple of decades, even since before then. But I do want to ask about Australia here. There are some similarities between Australia and Venezuela with population size, mineral wealth, and prospective value towards these large empires like the United States. So at the moment, there's only a couple of things separating Venezuela from Australia as far as the way the United States sees us. And they see us as a willing, sycophantic vassal that kind of does everything that they need for us. If not, we give them more than the average vassal does. We give them billions of dollars of our taxpayer base for things that are never going to eventuate. What warnings do you want to give to Australia as a large, resource wealthy state with a reasonably small population that is a middle power that depends on things like international law being adhered to, something Venezuela is not enjoying right now? Yeah, what warnings do you give to this country that seems a little bit daft sometimes when it looks around us at conflicts like Venezuela?
I think average Australians need to become aware of the role that the United States has actually played in the world, to take a critical and harsh look at what the United States has done around the world in the last 100 years, um, to try and objectively look at what are the positive elements of the United States domestically, internationally, and then look at the wars that it has carried out, the coup d'etats that it has carried out, how it's supported the Suharto dictatorship, how over 1 million people were killed in Indonesia, how over 200,000 people were killed in East Timor. Um, and when you begin to look at that very, very bloody record, you realize that the United States presents itself internationally as the defender of freedom and democracy, but it's actually the complete opposite. It has been the defender of profit and terror. It wasn't the case in Chile when a democratic president was overthrown in 1973. It wasn't the case in Argentina in 1976 when a very brutal military regime came to power and killed anywhere between 30 to 40,000 people that were tied up and thrown out of airplanes for simply being members of a trade union. If you look at that, you know, that role in the international arena, is that a country that you really want to be associated with? Is that a country that you really want to be going to war and sending your troops to defend private interest? Or do you want to try and distance yourself from that country? It's a country you're still going to have to negotiate with, you're still going to have to deal with. But currently, I understand there are several, I think it's about 800 homes that are being built in Western Australia for US troops that are part of the AUKUS agreement. When we have a housing crisis in this country, why should we be building housing for US troops? Why should Australia be positioning itself to eventually perhaps have a war with China, which is going to be devastating for us, simply because the United States is unable to negotiate with China Taiwan? It's not to say that, China's a wonderful country. It certainly isn't, and there's a lot of room for disagreement. But for a middle power like Australia, unfortunately, I think the upper echelons of this country, the elites in this country, and the political elites of this country have always been willing to simply just accommodate themselves to the imperial centers of the world. And historically, of course, that was Great Britain, and then it became the United States. But that's their interests. Those aren't the interest of common people. Our interest should be to create a more peaceful and a more democratic world. So if you have your own principles clear, you should be pushing in that direction towards creating a more democratic and a more peaceful world.
Yeah, some good words there, Rodrigo. We're seeing our government really struggling with that as it tries to claim its, its paragon status as it upholds international law and all these things. But they're so subjective and they're being cherry picked at the moment by a political class around a few of these flashpoints around the world at the expense of their own credibility and at the expense of our ability as a nation to function in the world around us. And there isn't much that's separating us from Venezuela. I mean, the coups of Latin America, you could argue, potentially happened here with a couple of prime ministers in the last few decades from Whitlam to Rudd, but just in a different way. And I wonder how much fear is motivating our political class right now in Australia, who might be hiding away in Canberra a little bit more than what we think. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a great holiday and a great break. And always a pleasure to have you on to give us a bit of an exotic take about what's going on there in Latin America, unfortunately in Australia. And it's great to get some great deep analysis from yourself. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.